Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Injury Law Pod. I am your host, Eric Bartlett, 29-year personal injury lawyer, and this is the podcast where we talk about all things personal injury law related. And up today, we're talking about farms and farm accidents. So, in Missouri, here, obviously in the Midwest, we have a strong agricultural identity. In Missouri, we have over 95,000 farms. They produce everything from soybeans, corn, to cattle and hogs. And fall, which is where we are now, is peak harvest season. It's a time when farmers are out in the fields and they are collecting their crops, and it's a time when farmers are working long hours, often in low light, long days, with fatigue and tight deadlines. All of these things increase the risk of accidents. And unfortunately, we have seen farm accidents here at my law firm. And obviously, when you're dealing with large equipment, maybe dangerous chemicals, things like that, usually injuries can be rather severe. And again, you have everything from tractors and combines, grain bins, livestock, and again, chemicals, and they cause hundreds of injuries every year. Now, most people think farming accidents are just part of the job, but under Missouri law, many of these incidents are preventable and can be legally actionable. Once somebody has sustained an injury or potentially a death, there are methods in place to potentially seek compensation for those injuries or for the death. So, today we're going to break down a little bit more about what the law looks like when it comes to farm operations and accidents that occur in those farming operations. So, just to start out, Missouri doesn't have a separate farm accident law per se, but agricultural hazards fall under general negligence. They may fall under workers' compensation, and they may fall under products liability claims. Now, OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they do have agricultural standards. They provide a baseline of safety rules for grain bins, tractor rollovers, chemical handling, things like that. But in reality, enforcement is limited, especially on smaller farms in the state. Missouri law also recognizes wrongful death claims that are brought under the Missouri wrongful death statute, which allows families to sue if negligence led to a fatal accident. For example, last year in 2024, there was a case out of Boonville involving an auger, and that case was handled under both Missouri's wrongful death statute and also as a product liability claim after a recalled safety guard was ignored. Here in our law firm this year, we have had a confidential settlement, and it involved farm equipment. It involved a serious injury to a person's body part, essentially involving the negligent operation of equipment. And so again, there's many different layers that can go into all of this, but it's going to depend on how is the farm set up, and who are the people involved? Are these employees? Are these family members? Are these members of the farm operation? And again, when we see something like this, we have to go through the analysis to figure out what legal remedies potentially are available. So in Missouri, there is a Missouri Workers' Compensation Act, and it applies to employers with 5 or more employees. There's specific exceptions set out in the statute, and one of those is for farm laborers. So, what basically that means is, generally speaking, farm laborers are not going to be covered under Missouri workers' compensation law. Now, that same exception list that is put into the workers' compensation statutory structure has other exceptions. For example, real estate agents, inmates that are in state or local correctional facilities that may be out working in some fashion while they're in prison. They are generally not covered by Missouri's Workers' Compensation Act. Now, however, if such individuals are hired in direct competition with non inmates or patients, say in some type of a facility, and their compensation is not affected by their status, the exemption does not apply. And then finally, a couple other exceptions to Missouri's workers' compensation requirements are for volunteers for tax exempt organizations and adjudicators, sports officials, or contest workers for interscholastic or similar amateur youth programs, if not otherwise employed by the sponsoring entity. So, again, these are all categories of workers that are specifically excluded from Missouri's workers' compensation coverage. Now, having said that, employers that are generally exempt under the Missouri workers' compensation structure may choose to be covered by the workers' compensation structure by purchasing a valid workers' compensation insurance policy or by written notice to their group self-insurer. Coverage begins on the effective date of the policy or notice and continues while the policy is in effect or until further written notice. So, again, what does all that mean? Any of these exempt groups, including farms, can choose to be covered with a workers' compensation insurance policy as a protection layer for them. If they're not, we'll talk about what that looks like here in a minute. But that's something that's very important to keep in mind. If you operate a decent sized farming operation and you have workers there, that's a way to protect yourself if something happens with one of your workers. And it's also a way to provide benefits to an injured worker. Now, exempt employers, such as a farm operation, may withdraw their election by canceling or not renewing their insurance policy or by written notice to the group self insured. So, again, even if a farm has chosen to purchase an insurance policy, but then later on decides they don't want to have that, they're free to go back to the exemption under the workers' compensation law. But, and before I move on there, insurance companies authorized to write workers' compensation policies in Missouri, they must file a memorandum with the division for every policy that's issued, renewed, or canceled using a form prescribed by the division. So that's on the insurance company to make sure all the appropriate forms are filed with the state. So now, some other intricacies with the farm work comp situation. For family farm corporations, mandatory coverage does not apply to family members or salaried officers of a family farm corporation. But these individuals may be covered if the board of directors approves it. And this provision does not apply to other types of corporations. This is specific to family farm operations. And also, a corporation with no more than 2 owners who are also the only employees may withdraw from coverage by filing a notice with the division. And that's a general exception. So basically, this statutory framework provides both categorical exemptions, and flexible options for employers to opt in or out of workers' compensation coverage subject to specific procedural requirements. Again, seasonal or migrant farm workers often fall outside of workers' compensation protections. And generally, because of that, it forces them into bringing some kind of a civil lawsuit or claim against the farm that they were working on if they're hurt. But what's the problem with that? Again, work comp is a no fault system. So if, for example, a worker is climbing up on a combine, falls off, gets hurt, and there is a workers' compensation policy in place, then that employee is going to be covered for their medical if they miss time from work and be eligible for a disability settlement at the end of it. But if there's no workers' compensation coverage, that same scenario, it's going to be a situation where that worker is going to have to try and prove that something about the work area, the work space that the employer provided was not safe. They're going to be making a claim essentially of negligence against the farm. So then you move into the realm of personal injury and making a personal injury claim. And again, there you're going to be required to have proof of negligence on the person the worker is making the claim against. But it does open up other areas of compensation, including pain and suffering, consortium, which is, for example, if the person injured is married and the spouse is now having to take care of the injured worker, and the injured worker cannot do the things that person would normally do at home, things like that claim can be made by the spouse. And then finally, punitive damages could be a potential avenue as well, which we've talked about many times in the past. Punitive damages are there to punish a wrongdoer if the level of wrongdoing rises to a willful type action. Now, for example, there was a St. Joseph corn farm seasonal worker a few years ago, and it was ruled that he was excluded from workers' comp, and he pursued a negligent action for unsafe equipment on the farm site. So, again, my takeaway is this: personally, coming from my viewpoint as a personal injury lawyer, if you're a farm operation and you have multiple employees, you're probably wise to put into place a work comp insurance coverage so that your employees are covered if they get hurt, you're covered if they get hurt, and you're not brought into a lawsuit where now you're having to defend some part of your operation. Now, a lot of times when someone is hurt on a farm, there's a question about the equipment, or again, maybe it's chemical exposure or something like that. And there's a question of whether the equipment that was being used, was it defectively designed, manufactured, or marketed? Was there a failure to warn of some safety hazard? Things like that. So not only might an injured worker have a claim somewhere in the mix regarding the employer and the equipment that was provided, or negligent operation of the equipment, or whatever that might look like. There's a host of ways that people get hurt by farm equipment, but there may also be a claim against the manufacturer of the equipment if there's some defect or some failure to warn of a safety hazard or something like that. So there can be multiple different claims out of one incident. And the other part of that is it could be covered by workers' compensation, but they still might have a claim against a product manufacturer if, again, there was something faulty about the equipment. But farmers that are injured by defective tractors, augers, or balers may sue even without proving negligence if they can bring a product's liability claim against the equipment manufacturer. There was a case against John Deere where it was alleged that there was a design defect over inadequate rollover protection on a tractor, for example. But what's going to be important is if a situation like this arises, evidence, as always, is going to be critical. The machinery is going to need to be preserved as it was at the time of the incident. There's going to also be a recall check to see if there had been any recalls by the manufacturer on the equipment for whatever the problem was that led to this injury or death. And it's probably going to be very helpful if, again, it's a serious injury or a death, to consult with agricultural engineers about the alleged dangerous equipment. Now, in the personal injury claim, again, there might be a claim about faulty equipment. There might be a claim for operator error, and there might also be a premises liability claim, which imposes duties on landowners to warn invitees of dangerous conditions. If for some reason, let's say the farm owner knew of a dangerous situation with equipment, failed to warn his laborers of that danger, then again, that could be a potential claim that the injured worker would have. Contractors like pesticide applicators or trucking companies, they can be sued under negligence if their acts create hazards as well. And then finally, utilities may be liable for unsafe power lines if they fail to comply with Missouri law, which imposes a duty to furnish safe facilities. Again, in our history, we've seen situations where power lines are too low and farm equipment comes into contact, and there might be an electrocution injury or death from something like that. From my home county, Pettis County, where I grew up, there was an electrocution case, and there were dual claims there against the landowner for failure to mark the power lines and against the utility for failure to safeguard against the utility lines. So again, there can be a lot that goes into an accident, and obviously it requires a level of knowledge and experience to figure out exactly where the claims are and who ultimately is responsible for this situation occurring. Now, some real world examples in Missouri, there was a wrongful death claim that was made for a child that was killed in a grain bin situation. There have been toxic exposure cases where pesticide, ammonia claims have been made that involve negligence and product liability for inadequate warnings. And there's also been claims made based on the OSHA standards on machine guarding, rollover protection, things like that. And many of these apply to farm hazards. Families face overwhelming medical debt, lost income, and operational setbacks when something like this occurs. Again, these are typically serious injuries or the loss of someone. And that's what we have seen here is very significant life-changing injuries or death. And when that happens, obviously compensation is critical to helping these injured people try to get some measure of their life back, because they very likely may not be able to go back to doing farm work after this. And so compensation becomes very critical in that instance. So, again, as always, very important steps. If a farm accident occurs, get immediate medical care, report the accident, obviously, to the farm owners. Potentially, there may be medical personnel or even the police called to a scene, and they may very well document things. But preserving evidence is critical. Again, the machinery, witnesses, usually there's more than just one or two workers that are at the scene, things like that. And attorneys must investigate under Missouri negligence law, workers' compensation law, and potential product liability laws. Key statutes that are involved for limitation periods, meaning how long you have to file a claim. Again, personal injury, you have 5 years in Missouri to make that claim. You have 3 years to make a wrongful death claim. And workers' compensation claims, you have 2 years from essentially the date of the injury or the date of last authorized medical care. So, again, there's important deadlines out there as well. So, we have to remember farmers feed our state and they deserve the same protections as any other workers. Just because they're out there on a field working with equipment, that doesn't differentiate them from somebody that's working at the Ford factory producing automobiles. And again, I think looking at it from both sides, for the farm owners and operators, it seems like a very wise decision to make sure you have the appropriate coverages in place so that if an accident does happen, and again, the statistics are very favorable for something bad happening at some point, then, the farm operation wants to be protected. And so having a workers' compensation policy in effect, again, if you've got multiple employees, probably a very smart way to operate the farm. Now, again, smaller farm, maybe family members, things like that, having a solid commercial liability insurance policy in place, because again, you never know. You never know what the situation is. It could be one brother causing another brother injury, something of that nature, and a claim may very well exist. And again, it's a horrible intra-family situation to be involved in, but we've seen it. And so again, if you want to go with the no fault route, you have a workers' compensation policy in place, things get covered that way. But if you don't, then a farm operation and its owners very well may be found responsible for some negligence that either they had a part of, or one of their employees had a part of, or something in that mix. And so, again, I just encourage everyone that hears this to take a minute, review your insurance policies. If you are a farm worker, know that you have rights. If you do get hurt, you can always reach out to us. And if you have been hurt, see what your options are, see what your rights are. It's always a free call. We're always happy to investigate. And I just want to take a moment. I want to thank all of our farmers that produce all the food that we eat every day. And I want to wish everyone a safe harvest season. And until next time, stay well and stay safe.